This is a chapter review for Vinland Saga 193, Thousand Year Voyage Part 2. I'm just looking forward to this chapter, of course, as I always do. But I did feel like this chapter was not the biggest in terms of like new revelations and new details to theorize about. So I expect this video is probably going to end up being a little shorter, but this is at the start of recording, of course. So we'll see how that plays out. I still think I found a good amount to talk about. So, to start, we have my expectations from the last chapter. So, I didn't have any major expectations going into this. I pretty much just thought we're going to be continuing with just the conflict as it's been set up. No major events expected here, just a continuation of what started with last chapter. And of course, it's Thousand Year Voyage Part 2. It's not a kind of standalone chapter like the ones we were getting before this. We're now kind of in the flow of a continuous sort of chain of events rather than these more episodic chapters. So, what I expected was that this just kind of be about the fallout of the Markland incident, and this kind of is that, and it also kind of extends a bit more into the fallout of the Vision, which is really good, and I'm happy we're finally addressing the Vision and its influence on the Gitpi tribe. So, yeah, no major expectations, so we could just kind of get into it. So we have Misekbikwe on the chapter cover here, with the subtitle, The Man Who Returned from a Hopeless Future. So that's immediately showing that we're going to be talking about the Vision today. And that's really exciting, really intriguing, and has me also a bit nervous because I've made it clear the Vision is not the most immediately appealing thing in this arc to me so far. But we'll get into later how I feel about how it was handled here just in this chapter. So we start the chapter with Thorfinn, Ivar, and Vargar having returned to the settlement after going to Markland to check on the settlers and finding out that they are missing. So I like here immediately we're being shown Thorfinn has no interest in keeping this under wraps to try to prevent panic or anything. He immediately wants to just tell everybody exactly what's going on. And that's great. That is just kind of a classic Thorfinn kind of behavior here. He values communication, and he has no interest in trying to control the masses by keeping secrets or anything. He is telling it how it is, so then on top of that, he can say what he's going to say afterwards. That despite this having happened and there being a conflict of some sort with a tribe of native people, this is not the same tribe. These are not the same people responsible for what happened in Markland that we have been interacting with here at Arne's village. This is a separate incident. And he makes it a point to say, like, there's like the distance. It takes 8 days to get to Markland by boat. There's no way the tribe would have gone there to stage an attack. That just wouldn't make sense. But it's also important to note that Thorfinn's saying here 8 days by boat, and that's not just like it'll take the natives 8 days because they're only using canoes. They don't have the same like sailing, I guess, abilities with their ships that the Norse do. So that 8 days is going to probably be even more for traversing that distance with the tribe. So overall, as if it wasn't obvious to us, the Gitpi tribe were not involved in the attack in Markland, which is very clear. Now, I was potentially considering the idea that the shaman Misekbikwe could have possibly influenced this attack by advising that tribe, because he is a very well-traveled person, and he has been shown to interact with other tribes, especially on the mainland as well, because the island we're on is, of course, an island, so they're kind of isolated a bit. And he has talked about before bringing things from the mainland, communicating things from the mainland. So he would kind of be able to travel, and it could explain something that he'd been doing in a long period of time. But we'll get a little bit more into that when we talk about the natives later. So, point is, Thorfinn makes it very clear that we cannot treat all indigenous people the same, and that the people we have been interacting with are not involved, so they should just continue to be friendly as they have been. But despite this, though, we immediately see anxiety and unease starting to develop in the settlement, and I can't blame them for this. I think this is very human to do. People are going to be unsure. But we see these unnamed settlers discussing the problem, discussing what happened with the Markland settlement. But interestingly, one of these unnamed settlers, he brings up that his brothers stay behind in Markland. I think this is interesting because these are unnamed background characters. They don't have like an arc to look out for. We don't know their names, so like they're clearly not meant to be personal. But Yukimura, it sets up this very personal connection to the Markland settlement, and that may just be to justify what this man is going to say going forward. But I think it's interesting that that's a very particular kind of strand being set up by Yukimura there, and I wonder if he's going to kind of continue it and maybe flesh out more of the settlers soon, because if there's any kind of weak part of this arc is that it focuses on two groups, but the general populace of these groups aren't very fleshed out. We're kind of focusing on subsets of these larger groups and really focus on our characters that we care about. And you know, that's always how Yukimura's been. Like, we had Askeladd's band, but really the only people who came out of that mattering by the end of it was like Bjorn, Askeladd, Thorfinn, and somewhat Canute, even though he's not really part of that band. But overall, there's very few generic people that actually are fully fleshed out. So we can kind of see that that's just kind of Yukimura's writing style, so I won't fault him for that or anything. But it would be interesting to kind of set up a bit more personal narratives going on with these settlers. But we can see that with this anxiety developing and the fear kind of taking in, these settlers are kind of falling into these ideas that match what Ivar has been insisting, getting more ships and more weapons. Well, not more weapons, having any weapons. And this is stuff that Ivar has been pushing and pushing for quite some time, and now we can see that when that panic and fear is starting to settle in, they're kind of falling into agreement with him. They're not bringing him up and saying, Ivar was right, but they're kind of now in a position where Ivar's ideals can kind of get a grip on them because they're scared. And despite this, though, we do see some settlers are taking Thorfinn's words to heart, and they're not really giving in to fear, and they're saying, hang on, Thorfinn told us not to lump all natives together, and that the Gitpi tribe are not related. And then Einar joins in. He joins the conversation. He says, in agreement, that exactly, Pulmuk is kind, and Nisquaji is trying to learn our language. So he references them as kind of proof that they have gone a distance to learn about the culture and kind of, you know, get involved with the settlers. And that's not just like fake. Like, these are real connections that they've brought up with these people. And it's super important that we have the settlers remember that. And we see here the women of the village generally are being shown to share in this more hopeful perspective of the situation. And Yukimura does this a lot. Usually the kind of motherly characters are all very understanding and they're very compassionate. And that's just kind of a trend of Yukimura's writing, really, that he continues here. But then we have Mr. Uggy intrude on this conversation, calling them naive. And this is kind of the major point of this part of the chapter, this the Norse side of the chapter. And, you know, this whole time, Mr. Uggy has just been shown over multiple chapters to be extremely paranoid. But this is the first time his paranoia has been applied to something very serious. Because we saw, like, on the ship, taking the ship across the ocean, across from Greenland to Vinland, he was terrified of, like, the sea and the sea monsters, and his paranoia was kind of introduced there. And then his paranoia continued with Hild's machinery and him calling it witchcrafts. So those are all kind of like one-off jokes, but just to establish his character, and now it's being applied to a real serious situation. But he reminds them that before their expedition, there had been previous settlers who tried to settle Vinland with Leif's son, I believe. He tried to settle, and then they ended up in a war with the native people. And for the same reasons as the Markland settlement, though, we have to remember this cannot be the same tribe. Like, this was in a completely different location. It's not the same people. So he's already kind of falling into this generalization of them. It's saying that this shows that that's their nature. And it's obviously a very unfair assumption for him to make. And we can see that even like some of these more anxious settlers from earlier, they still see that, hey, this line of thought might be a bit too much. You're overthinking it. But Mr. Uggy doesn't back down. He continues mentioning an axe that went missing, and he's implying that the Gitpi tribe stole it because they want these strong iron tools and weapons and other things of interest that the settlers have brought with them. And Einar tries to defuse the situation, reminding them that, you know, they've been very friendly this whole time, and there's been no sign of anything like this happening. But Mr. Uggy believes that, no, they just want to scout the village. They're pretending to be friendly so they can get in, assess our numbers, assess our strength. And he thinks this makes perfect sense. And this makes Einar finally snap. And he's telling him that there's like no evidence for any of these things that he's thinking, but Mr. Uggy, again, he does not just concede. And then he goes to say that Thorfinn and Einar are too kind. And he especially brings up here that from the natives' perspective, they are just invaders. And we'll see going forward that that's going to be very important coming up soon. But he says that it makes sense that they would see them as invaders because they've continuously expanded after barging into this land. And he has a good point here. Like, they have taken up a lot of space to make their fields. When we first got to the settlement, there was a lot of trees, and it didn't look like the Vinland that we pictured all this time leading up to the actual Vinland arc. The Vinland we had pictured was these long stretches of meadows, but we had a kind of bit of a not dense forest, but like some plains with trees kind of dotting the landscape. And we can see in this top panel, look how much distance they've taken up. The fields have grown significantly. And we'll see later, Mr. Uggy's right to say that they probably won't be too happy with them taking down the trees. He may not understand the exact reason, and he doesn't really empathize or sympathize with the reasons why they would be uncomfortable with the Norse cutting down these trees and expanding the fields. But he still is kind of falling into the human nature, saying it's natural to think this way, where he's just being skeptical and bringing up these suspicions. And you can see that this makes Einar finally hesitate, because he doesn't have a snappy response anymore. He's hesitating. And you can see at the bottom panel here as well, he's also hesitating. And we can see Uggy's fully retreating into this paranoia. He's literally pulling his hat in and retreating into his fear and paranoia here. And he's insisting, just like Ivar has been since the beginning, they need to get weapons, they need to scout, and they need to be prepared for the worst. Just as Ivar thinks a leader always should be. And this is huge. But moving away from the Norse, now we go to the perspective of the Gippy tribe, where we can see the shaman, Misekbikwe, warning the tribe that the Norsemen are invaders, just as Mr. Uggy said. But the big question is, will the tribe agree with this perspective? And he insists here that they cannot allow the settlers to continue to destroy the forest and disrespect the spirits. And this whole thing about disrespecting the spirits is huge, and we really need to focus on it more. And it looks like the conflict is going to focus a bit more on kind of that spirituality and tradition rather than the vision itself, and we'll get into that a little bit more with the discussion. But he calls back here, speaking of the vision, he calls back to it and the destruction he witnessed. But interestingly, this is kind of different from what I expected. We can see that the reaction of the tribe in general is not very strong. Most seem disinterested or, at worst, hesitant. And that's very, very interesting to me because my major concern with the vision was that it would suddenly change everyone's minds and make them against the settlers despite all the good that's come from it. And we could see here immediately they're all not immediately kind of giving into this. And then the shaman sees that Pulmuk is sleeping here behind the tree. And Pulmuk has been shown, since his introduction, to kind of be a leadership figure of the tribe. He's not the chief, of course, but he's usually kind of leading these expeditions out to the settlement, and he was leading the kind of investigations, and he's been an important part of interacting with the settlers. So, him being a leader, the shaman specifically calls him out for not listening, and we can see he was sleeping, and then the shaman brings up that he's still drinking the fire water from the Norse. And this is extremely important because it's mentioned here in the bottom left of the page. Alcohol was not part of their culture. It was not brought there until the Europeans brought it. So they had no experience with alcohol. And I'm going to talk a bit about this more in the future. Well, later in this video, rather. That this is a very, very important thing, and it's not simply just that, oh, Pulmuk's getting drunk, and he might do something stupid while he's drunk. The alcohol is a very important part of the real history here, and we'll get into that a bit more. But the shaman accuses him of already being poisoned by the Norsemen, and as Pulmuk stands up here, we could see kind of the extent he's really leaned into the Norse culture by interacting with the settlers, because he's now wearing Norse clothes. And he says, oh, they're comfortable. And he tells the people who are intrigued by it that they can get more the next time they trade. And this is a really nice little detail because Thorfinn made it a point to establish a trading relationship with the indigenous people. And this was kind of his big motivator because when he talked to Halfdan, he kind of put together why Halfdan can't kill him. And it wasn't just because of the law, like Halfdan said. It was because they have a mutual agreement that benefits them. This mutual benefit of each other. And that's why he wants to establish a trade relationship rather than, like he said before, a kind of cycle of gift giving without really knowing what the other wants. And we can see here, he successfully communicated that desire, even though like he hasn't like learned the Mi'kmaq language and known what to say to communicate the idea, but through their actions, they've communicated it, and now trade is a natural part of them getting what they want to get. And this directly contradicts what Uggy was saying before about how if they want something, they're going to steal it. We can see here, if they want something, they're going to look for the trade opportunity because that's the precedent that's been established by Thorfinn. And really interestingly here on the next page, we see that Pulmuk is well aware of the whole vision thing. I was under the assumption that because the tribe had been interacting very like friendly and normal with the settlers, that the shaman hadn't told them yet. But based on this, he says, nah, we've heard it so many times already, and know it by heart. And he even talks about these little details like the invisible arrow and storm of doom. This is really interesting to me, because this means, despite knowing this, or potentially having known this before the last interaction we had saw between these two groups, they are still interacting normally and friendly, and they're not kind of giving in, just like we saw before with the tribe being hesitant to strongly react to what the shaman was saying. And this is definitely not what I expected. And on top of this, Pulmuk is talking here, he genuinely believes in the shaman's abilities. He doesn't like disrespect the fact that he's a great seer and treat him like he's wrong. But he's saying that it doesn't significantly matter to him because he himself has not seen it. And he compares this to what he has seen and what he has felt. The wheat fields that produced bread, and the bread he made, and that bread can feed people. And the shaman brings up, well, the trees were destroyed to make those fields. The forests have been destroyed, and those are an important part of their spirituality and their culture. But Pulmuk still, he says, well, what's wrong with that? And Pulmuk goes on to say, well, in their culture, they rely on the forest and the sea to provide blessings of nature in order for them to survive. They have to get lucky. They have to find some, animals. They have to catch fish. They have to get lucky. And especially when winter comes, that becomes even harder, both to find those things and traverse the forests to look for those things. But with the fields, food is born from the same place time and time again, and we can create it as many times as we want with our own power. Pulmuk is looking at this from the perspective of, why should I be afraid of this vision if I can see right in front of me the benefit? How elderly people and children can live comfortably. We don't need to wander. We can be comfortable in one place. How is that a bad thing? And the shaman insists that they cannot change their way of life as the Great Spirit has set out for them. And then Pulmuk responds that you'll never know unless you try. And then this makes the shaman kind of give up on him here. You can see in this bottom right panel, he's almost like ugh, okay. And then he turns to the Chief Gippy, and he asks for his thoughts. The chief shows this deep respect for Misek, and the benefits that have come from following his advice have been so impactful for them in the past. And he insists that they'll keep an eye out and keep a close watch on the Norse and be on guard for these weapons from this vision. But ultimately, he wants to believe in the good that comes from these interactions and comes from the Norse being here and being present. And he sees the things that they can learn could be of great benefit to the tribe going forward. And we could see the tribe kind of unanimously agrees to this idea. They're on the same page. The settlers have been kind to them. They have benefited from the trade with them. This is ultimately a good thing for them right now, and they don't have a reason to throw it all away just because of a vision. And we could see the shaman kind of concedes to this. And Pulmuk says another interesting thing here that I think we need to keep in mind, that he says he'll do his best to prevent the future that the shaman saw from happening. So this shows he sees the vision as something that can be prevented by continuing friendly relationships rather than something that absolutely will happen. And that is something that's very, very appreciated for this story, because again, we don't want the vision to be the end-all be-all of the conflict. The vision to them is something that can be used to advise them rather than a warning of what absolutely will happen. But I did skip ahead here a bit. One thing to note here, you can see, looking at Nisquajij in the middle panel here, she is so concerned here because she's in a very, very tough spot where she has had kind of equal influence from the spiritual visions and guidance from the shaman, as well as the good that has come from the interactions with the settlers, as she's become very close with Bug Eyes as the diplomat and interpreter. She's learned their language to some extent. So she's kind of in this awful middle ground, and it's clearly going to affect her a lot. But then, after this, the shaman quickly and intensely leaves the settlement, and he's lamenting that persuasion didn't work, but he has to continue to do whatever it takes, as Nisquaji kind of falls behind here. She's struggling to keep up, and that's not just like a physical thing. This is kind of like a more, thematic meta thing where he's kind of starting to leave her behind because she's in between two worlds right now. And this panel of her kind of concerningly keeping up while he intensely moves forward relentlessly kind of shows how these two are really starting to separate, because she was introduced as his companion when he first entered the story, and now she's kind of becoming her own person and learning new things that don't necessarily correlate with what he's teaching her. And Nisquaji is going to be one of my favorite characters. I really love what Yukimura is doing with her here, and I'm excited to see how this kind of internal conflict ends up building up for her. But let's get into the kind of more analysis-focused part of this video. So, this chapter, as we saw, was structured around covering each group's reaction to their kind of respective inciting incident, with the settlers reacting to what happened in Markland, and the Gitpi tribe reacting to the shaman's persuasion and his vision. And these two inciting incidents have been set up perfectly to kind of mirror each other a little bit and have these two mirrored conversations happening at once. Interestingly, it seems like the settlers are having this stronger emotional reaction to what's happening. We can see that they're giving into the paranoia, and they already start talking about how they misjudged all these new people. And then the Gitpi tribe, on the other hand, is more interested in looking at the good that's come from interacting with the Norse, rather than just taking the vision at face value like I worried they would. And although the natives do believe the shaman, and they don't think the vision is a lie or anything like that, they deeply respect him. The key difference, though, is that the settlers are reacting to like a past incident here, while the natives are reacting to an incident that they believe they might be able to prevent. And it's like Pulmuk said, they don't really get it because they cannot see what the shaman has seen, whereas the settlers here have seen something already happen. So that kind of explains this difference in reaction, where the settlers are kind of a bit more aggressive because they think some of our people died from an attack, and that's a very big thing. Obviously, they don't know exactly what happened, and nobody knows yet exactly what happened to the Markland settlers, but I think, although I do wish they weren't reacting so emotionally and strongly immediately, I think it makes sense considering the difference in how these two groups are, I guess, seeing this inciting incident. But the most important thing with the settlers here is going to be Mr. Uggy and his conversation with them. Overall, like I said before, he's been shown to be incredibly paranoid, and he's not somebody we're supposed to look at and think is reasonable. He's supposed to be the extreme of paranoia. But despite that, not everything he says here is entirely wrong. Because he brings up here that the settlers that came before them ended up in a war, and he's right. But he fails to understand why. Why did that conflict happen? He sees it as it being their nature, when there is a much more human and much more complicated situation at play there. If I remember correctly, I think Leif mentioned that his son they were the first ones to attack. They instigated the conflict. So he again has a correct point here to mention that there was conflict before this, but he is coming to the wrong conclusion. And then again, he's right to bring up this missing axe as a concern, but he just allows this to come to his head and lead to conclusions about them wanting to steal weapons, wanting to steal the tools to use them as weapons, because they're made of iron and they do not have access to iron. And furthermore, he's right that the Gitpi tribe do want many things the settlers have. But we see from the conversation with Pulmuk and the other natives who are interested in getting some of the Norse attire, that they're happy to have this trade relationship and engage with that trade relationship, and they're not looking to just steal whatever they want. And then again, he's right to say that what they're doing, essentially, is taking land and expanding as they please like invaders. He's absolutely not wrong about that. And he believes that this may seem like they are invaders to them. And he's not even wrong about that, because the shaman believes they are invaders. So he's even right that some people will think that. But he just lets this play into his paranoid suspicions and justify his feelings and his fears. And overall, he just allows this mix of rights followed by just the complete wrong conclusions due to paranoia to ultimately lead to this final conclusion that they need to get armed and prepare for the worst, just as Ivar had been saying this whole time. And this is perfectly building up to potentially creating a faction that follows Ivar rather than Thorfinn. So, a faction that kind of abandons what Thorfinn is going for and allows Ivar to be their leader. Because he's a leader that will give in to the paranoia and prepare for the worst, so everyone who's as scared as he is will feel safe. Ivar is also an incredibly paranoid and scared person. And he's a bit more collected than Uggy, and he doesn't come off as somebody who's kind of going too far. He comes off as reasonable to somebody who's afraid, because he is just as afraid as they are. He just presents it differently as a leader. But in reality, giving into this paranoia will only be to their detriment and will only lead to the inevitable failure of the Vinland settlement. But let's talk a bit more about the Gitpi tribe and the shaman. So we've been waiting quite a few chapters to see exactly how the vision would be handled going forward in the story. And I think Yukimura did exactly what he needed to do here. I think this was absolutely perfect. The shaman initially comes off very strongly about the vision, and he has not held back any of the details. He has not forgotten anything. He has retained exactly what he saw and has described it to the best of his abilities. And this made me very concerned at first, because I was hoping what would come from the vision was only his feelings, and he wouldn't have these true visions of the future retained after that traumatic experience. But that is not what Yukimura chose to do here. What he does do here, though, to help with that, is he uses Pulmuk as a perfect counterweight to balance out the shaman's incredibly strong and spiritual reaction based on the vision, and the vision being an absolute truth of the future. And Pulmuk shows two important things. One, they do not consider the visions of the future to be absolutely guaranteed. He says at the end of the chapter, or rather near the end on this second to last page, that he'll do his best to prevent the future they saw from happening. So he doesn't see the vision as something that will happen. He's not immediately jumping to arms because of it. This is something that, again, like I said before, is something that could advise them to avoid this outcome, rather than being something that will and must happen. And then secondly, they've not simply just casted off all the good that has come from interacting with the settlers. They are kind of retaining still the exact benefits of the food and the wheat, and how that's going to allow them to live more comfortable lives and help them take care of their children and their elderly, and not have to move from place to place with people who can't make the journey. And the rest of the tribe too talks about just generally how friendly the settlers have been to them. And this is super important to me, because my big concern with the vision is that it would be used as an inciting factor that makes our Gitpi tribe here become incredibly suspicious and just kind of turn on the settlers quickly. But Pulmuk is used absolutely perfectly here. But speaking of Pulmuk, we have the introduction of the alcohol. And again, like I said before, this is very important. I'm going to get into it now. Yukimura has already shown hints of future destruction with the Sailing West chapters and some of the Vinland chapters, where we have like the rats in the ship, which will bring diseases that the natives have never been exposed to, and the introduction of milk, which Thorfinn gave as a gift near the beginning. And milk is not something that their bodies would be able to process. So alcohol here is no different. Because the natives had not had alcohol until European influence, their bodies literally had not developed to properly handle it. And this allows them to essentially just continuously drink without their bodies doing anything to remove the alcohol. And this leads to alcoholism destroying entire communities of native people and leading to a harsh negative stigma when true like settlement came to North America. It led to the stigma of native people all being these drunks, and it genuinely led to a lot of destruction. And one interesting thing here is you can see throughout this conversation the blush from Pulmuk's face kind of slowly disappears and fades away. And you can kind of see this is kind of showing like this high tolerance. Like he can just continuously and continuously drink, and this is something that will lead to destruction in the future, and it's an absolute truth that that happens in history. And this is, like I said before, one of many things Yukimura has kind of just planted the seed for, because that is how things will slowly begin to dwindle and lead to misunderstanding. But ultimately, with this conversation between Pulmuk and Misek, we are given just a better understanding of how the native side of this conflict is being set up. It's being made less about the vision, and it's more about them kind of weighing their spiritual traditions against the potential benefits of their relationship with the settlers. And if things start to go wrong, like alcohol, the milk, disease from the rats, they can start to see this as a sign that what they're doing is wrong, and that they can't go against the settlers, and they need to push them out. And this is a much more natural conflict, a much more grounded conflict, compared to the vision making them scared and making them do things that they wouldn't have done. The vision is not kind of the end-all be-all ultimate factor here, and that's exactly what we needed after chapter 189. This is perfect. And another thing, Pulmuk's line here of "you never know unless you try" is directly parallels Thorfinn kind of going against the established way of life in his culture, because the shaman says you cannot change the way of life set out by the Great Spirit. This is how the world is. And Pulmuk, he's wearing the Norse attire and he's doing this pose of his arms crossed. He's being set up here as a reflection of Thorfinn on the native side. And he's being used incredibly well. Another interesting point, though, is that Chief Gitpi tells the shaman that they will be on guard for the weapons that he saw in the vision. And this kind of brought to my head, they have no way of knowing how far in the future that vision is showing. The shaman has no reason to believe that it's 1,000 years in the future. To him, like, this could be a near future that's just around the corner that Thorfinn is setting up for. Because, again, they have no idea to know that these weapons are such advanced technologies. In their limited scope, this could be just something that they cannot understand and could potentially be out there right now. And I didn't even consider that when I first read the Vision chapter. And I think it's good that it's kind of being addressed here, that they're considering the fact that they could be real things right now, and they will keep an eye out for the appearance of them. And then one more thing, this panel at the end here, at the bottom of this page, is really, really interesting to me. When I first read this, I thought something was being thrown or shot at the tribe from through the trees. And like on the next page here, you can see that it's just vision lines to kind of be this transition to show the intensity of the shaman's movements. But I think this panel also just doubles as playing off of the reader's, feeling of tension and unease. Because when I saw this, at least, I thought, oh my god, did somebody like shoot an arrow at them? A mysterious settler in the woods, you know? But I think that potentially was intentional to really play off this unease and tension that's been building up. No way to know that for sure, but I thought that was pretty cool. But overall thoughts, although this chapter didn't really kick off any major new events or provide details that made me fully reassess my expectations, I think it did a great job of just kind of reassuring me of the direction the story would be taking with this conflict. And my concerns about the Vision have kind of faded. I've become way more comfortable with it. And part of that is that I've done more research into Mi'kmaq culture, and it's become very clear to me that Yukimura has absolutely done his research exceptionally well. Obviously, I'm not a person who would know a lot about Mi'kmaq culture. I'm going to be ignorant to that, and Yukimura especially would have no reason to be, I guess, any less ignorant, besides just doing very good research here. Especially like from Japan. I think it's very impressive how well researched he is about a specific subset of native culture. And I just think he's done a great job from what I've gathered so far. And specifically, the role of Misekpekwe as the Puowin, the shaman, the healer in Mi'kmaq culture, and especially the aspect of future sight, is incredibly important. So this absolutely cannot be something that could be excluded when properly depicting this tribe. Or, any Mi'kmaq tribe. This is something that needs to be shown, because in history they absolutely would have had the Puowin perform a ritual to see into the future. Although it still bothers me a bit that Mi'kmaq spirituality has kind of been just blanketly shown to be real in the story, while, Christianity and Norse spirituality have been actively kind of detracted from throughout the story. But I ultimately think it's a good thing that Yukimura has treated their spirituality with a great deal of respect, and I think he saw the Vision as an opportunity to address the real history, like I talked about in the 189 review. I think he saw the Vision as a way to show the reader this imagery because he thinks it's important that we acknowledge it and know it for the sake of understanding the larger message of the story. So I think at this point, Vision has served its purpose within the Gippy tribe of simply planting seeds of doubt without completely making the natives turn on the settlers that they've, up to this point, gotten along with very well. And I'm really happy Pulmuk was used to kind of take the side of the reader and accomplish this balance. And speaking of Pulmuk, this chapter did an incredible job at making me like Pulmuk. I already liked him before, but I felt like he was kind of a not very fleshed out character. I thought Nisquajij was getting a lot more focused, and she was a bit more of our kind of perspective character for the Gitpi tribe. But he is absolutely more involved with the Gitpi tribe because Nisquajij is a bit more involved with the shaman and what he does. So I'm glad that this has really fleshed out and made us understand Pulmuk as a character. Because when he was introduced, he was shown kind of being skeptical of these unknown white people showing up in their land, and he was one of the first people to talk about fighting. So I thought he might be the, like a potential loose cannon warrior type person, but this chapter showed me I absolutely misjudged him, and I should have waited for a bit more context on his character, because this chapter goes a long way. It shows that he's like extremely reasonable and level-headed, and with his response to the warnings, and specifically how he is looking at this from the leadership position of, I can make the lives of my tribe, of my people, easier. And I absolutely love what Yukimura has done with Pulmuk, and this has made him one of my favorite new characters in this arc. But that's all for my thoughts on chapter 193. Again, like I said, not the most, I guess, impactful chapter in terms of advancing the narrative and introducing a new idea or having some big event occur, but it just did a really good job of showing where things are going and kind of clarifying points of concern for readers, and I think that is very, very valuable. It's overall just a chapter we have been waiting for since 189, and I'm glad it was handled this way. But next chapter predictions. So, based on this last page, next chapter may show us Misek's next move. That's kind of what it's gearing up towards here. He's shown to be very driven and willing to do whatever it takes. I personally hope he doesn't actively instigate too extremely. It would really suck if he just suddenly like started doing things to create suspicion on both sides and started manipulating people. I don't believe he's the type of person to do that. So I'm very unsure what he can do next. I still think he possibly could have played a role in what happened in Markland. I don't know. So I'm eager to see what he will do, but I'm not sure where things will go for him. I'm not sure what next step he could take. But speaking of making the next move, we didn't see Ivar at all this chapter. But I think we'll see him start to make moves next chapter as well. We've seen in this chapter that the anxiety and paranoia have taken hold on some of the settlers and have pushed them to fall into a mindset that matches Ivar very well. So he's likely going to see this as an opportunity to usurp leadership to some degree. So we'll see where that goes. And we also might get more settler reactions to what has happened from more important core characters like Gudrid, Hild, Bug Eyes. So I'm eager to see where that goes, especially Cordelia, considering how Cordelia has been set up as a potential avenue of corruption for Ivar and his guys. So Stork and Ganglanti. So eager to see what's going to happen there, and I want to see a little bit more of our main cast of characters here. But we could also just continue to see the beginning of misunderstandings between the two groups. Now we've had the seeds planted, and the stage has essentially been set for these little incidents of misunderstanding. And one that stands out to me is the axe that has been mentioned during this chapter. It is possible it was stolen, but it could also be a scenario where it was simply misplaced. And I could easily see a scenario where if it was just misplaced and one of the Gitpi tribe comes across it, they might bring it back to the settlement to return it or something. Or try to trade for it, you know? They might be like, oh, this is cool, what can I give you for it? But that could result in a dangerous misunderstanding if they see somebody approaching with an axe, you know? So I'm definitely concerned about the axe, the alcohol, the milk, the rats. There's so many little things that are just ticking time bombs. And we just gotta wait till next month to see where that goes. So that's gonna do it for me. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you then.